Okay, so now at this point we've completely finished with the poly painting on this Rhino. So now let's begin the process of exporting the various maps to go back to our primary 3D application. Alright, so here's the map as it exists right now. You can see not too bad for being completely hand sculpted. We never had to use any sort of photographic references, so we were able to make our maps as detailed or as non-detailed as we need to. So right now, I mentioned a little bit earlier in this training kit that these poly painting points that we have are really pretty much just the equivalent of vertex coloring. It's just that we have so many vertices on this object that each vertex pretty much acts like a pixel. So all the painting that we've done right now is not actually a 2D texture, and nothing that we painted is related in any way to this object's UV layout. So what's nice is this object could have its own UV layout that you could then go back and make any adjustments to, and it would not in any way affect the way that this vertex information is colored when we look at this flat shaded object. Okay? So let's begin the process of actually converting this poly painting into a 2D texture. Now this step actually does require the object to have some sort of a UV layout applied to it, because now we're going to convert all this into a 2D texture. So the first thing we need to do is assign some sort of a texture onto this object for it to be converted onto. So we'll go to Texture, and we'll make a new texture. On an object this size, we'd probably want to make sure this is at least a 3K image. Probably a 4K would work just as well. So we'll go 4096 by 4096. New. Okay, and my object disappeared. And the reason is probably because right now I have my main color set to black, which a lot of times gets equated into transparency. So let's try this again. Let's make the color white, and try that again. Make a new 4096 by 4096 texture. There we go. That's much better. So now we have a white texture that's been applied to this, but we still have our vertex coloring, because if I turn the texture off, as in no texture, you can see everything comes back as far as our poly painting. So we'll go back to this texture that we just made, and now with this sitting on the object, if we go up to, let's collapse this, if we go up to texture, we have the option to convert colors to texture. Now in order for this to work properly, one thing that we also need to make sure of is that the RGB intensity is set all the way up to 100. So that way 100% of the vertex coloring gets transferred onto this texture. So now we'll go color to texture. We'll give Zbrush just a second to calculate all the different information. So there it is. And you can see now we have a texture that perfectly matches that vertex coloring. Right? And that's going to be, again, corresponding to the UV layout that we applied to our object. Now we could also use Zbrush's built-in UV tools if you hadn't had a chance to actually make a UV layout back in your primary 3D application. Zbrush has several UV functions that we can apply. Okay, now as far as this texture goes, the one thing that we do need to do before we actually export it is we need to actually flip this image vertically. And the reason being that Zbrush reads its up and down information, or its vertical information, a little bit differently than most applications. So before we export this, let's pull down the texture menu. Let's flip this image vertically. So we'll give this a second. And you'll notice that your result, or your mesh, is now going to look very different. And that's just because it's now taking into account the black information that's between the actual UVs. So if I hover, you can see how in my image we have these transparent areas, and those are what are being revealed here on the mesh. So everything's completely normal. Now with this being flipped, let's go to Export Texture. Okay, Let's now save this out. We have a few different file formats to choose from: a PSD file for Photoshop, a bitmap, or a TIFF. So I'll go ahead and use a bitmap. Color, Rhino color. It looks like I accidentally had my cap locks turned on. Let's do Rhino color dot BMP. A lot of times you'll also have to remember to actually put the extension at the end of your file. Otherwise, Zbrush will go ahead and name it a PSD file, even if you have one of these different extensions chosen. So just go ahead and make sure you type in the actual extension you want. Save this out. And there we go. So if you want, you can go ahead and flip this back the way that you want, if you want to be able to just view it here within Zbrush. Right, and if we take a look at that image, here's the actual bitmap that was generated for us by Zbrush. So you can see all of that texturing detail gets carried right over. And now we can use this texture map in any 3D application that we want to. Alright, so now that we have these color map that have been exported out, let's now, in the next lesson, start to focus on the process of generating the normal maps and the displacement maps.